The unraveling of LRA living with LRA in Pasadena had been a dream, until her ayahuasca retreat in Bolivia turned our cozy apartment into a stage for her chilling descent into madness. My name is Stephanie. I'm in my 30s, and I'm from Pasadena, California. I mention this because, as a listener, I always find it frustrating when storytellers don't clarify who they are up front. My name is Stephanie. I'm in my 30s and I'm from Pasadena, California. I only mention that because, as a listener, I find it super annoying when people don't make it clear who they are at the start of their stories. In the spring of late 2017, I'd been living with a girl named LRA for 2 years, and she was hands down one of the most laid-back roommates I'd ever had. In the spring of late 2017, I'd been living with a girl named LRA for 2 years, and she was easily one of the most chill roommates I'd ever had. We met through a friend of a friend when I first moved to Pasadena, desperate for a place to stay, and LRA had a spare room and rent she couldn't cover alone, so we made it work. We'd met through a friend of a friend when I first moved to Pasadena, and I was desperate for a place to stay. LRA had a spare room and a rent that she couldn't cover alone, so we made it work. At 26, she was just a year older than me, but she had this worldly maturity that turned our cramped 2-bedroom apartment into a real home. At 26, she was only a year older than me, but she had this sort of worldliness and maturity that made our cramped 2-bedroom apartment feel more like a home. LRA was an artist in her spare time, and a talented one, always sketching birds, vines, or spiraling shapes in her little book, her creativity spilling over into our home decor. She was an artist in her spare time, and she was a good one too. She was always drawing things in her little sketchbook, birds or vines, or pretty spiraling shapes, and she was just as creative when it came to home decor. She wasn't a party animal, which I appreciated since my coffee shop job had me up at 5:30 a.m., and I'd always leave the coffee pot warm for her before heading out. She wasn't a huge party animal either, which was nice because my job at a coffee shop involved waking up at 5:30 in the morning, and I'd keep the coffee pot warm for her in the morning before I headed to work. We had an unspoken rhythm, a simple, comfortable routine that made living together feel effortless. It was simple, comfortable, like we figured out some unspoken rhythm. Then, one day in April 2017, LRA sat me down at our kitchen table, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she announced she was going to Bolivia for 2 weeks for an ayahuasca retreat, a journey she seemed already halfway embarked on in her mind. Then one day in April of 2017, she sat me down at her kitchen table and told me that she was going to Bolivia for 2 weeks. Her eyes had this spark about them as she mentioned something called an ayahuasca retreat, like she was already halfway there. I didn't know what ayahuasca was. It sounded like some yoga trend, so I smiled and told her it sounded amazing. I didn't know what ayahuasca was at the time. It sounded like some kind of yoga thing, so I just sort of smiled and said, it sounded amazing. A week later, she packed her things and left, and I waved from the window, wishing her safe travels, expecting her to return with wild stories and maybe a quirky souvenir. Then around a week later, she packed her things and off she went. I wished her safe travels, waved from the window, and figured that she'd return with some epic stories and maybe a kooky souvenir or two. That night, alone in the apartment, I Googled ayahuasca and learned it was a hallucinogenic tea used in rituals in places like Peru or Brazil, where people drank it with shamans, vomited violently, and saw visions of gods, demons, or whatever lurked in their minds, claiming it cracked you open or released your soul. That night I was alone in the apartment, and I Googled ayahuasca and learned it was a kind of hallucinogenic tea used in rituals down in places like Peru or Brazil. People drank it with shamans, puke their guts out, and then saw visions of gods or demons or whatever else lurked inside their minds. Users claimed it was supposed to crack you open or release your soul, among dozens of other very grandiose statements. That wasn't my scene. I preferred my reality unscrambled, my feet firmly on the ground. But for LRA, it must have seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. And that wasn't my kind of scene. I liked my reality unscrambled and my feet planted, very solid on the ground. But for LRA, it must have sounded like the adventure of a lifetime. She was the spiritual one, always chasing something deeper with meditation apps, tarot cards, or the quartz crystals she kept on the windowsill. She was the spiritual one, always chasing something deeper with stuff like meditation apps, tarot cards, or the cluster of quartz crystals that she kept on the windowsill. I went to bed imagining her returning with a tan and a story about conversing with a jaguar spirit, a whimsical image that felt so quintessentially LRA. And I went to bed imagining her coming back with a tan and some crazy tale about talking to a jaguar spirit. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a set of tarot cards for a friend's birthday, only to find they were missing half the deck, a small betrayal that echoed the trust I'd placed in LRA's journey. The apartment felt different without her, the quiet a stark contrast to our usual rhythm, the absence of her laughter and sketches leaving a void I hadn't expected. I kept things running in her absence, watering her plants, tidying the space, and leaving the coffee pot ready each morning, a ritual that felt hollow without her presence. Pasadena was sunny that spring, the streets lined with blooming jacarandas, their purple petals carpeting the sidewalks, a beauty I tried to focus on to distract from the unease that crept in as the days passed. I'd always been the practical one, the one who kept our little home grounded while LRA brought the magic, the sketches on the fridge, the crystals catching the light, the stir-fries we'd share on quiet evenings. We'd built a life together, a fragile balance of our differences, and I held on to the hope that she'd return as the same vibrant soul I'd come to love. I spent those 2 weeks working my shifts at the coffee shop, the early mornings a blur, of steaming milk and sleepy customers, my mind often drifting to LRA, wondering what she was experiencing in the jungles of Bolivia. I'd never been one for spirituality, my life rooted in the tangible, my job, my routines, the familiar hum of our apartment. But LRA's passion for the mystical had always fascinated me, a window into a world I'd never dared to explore. I imagined her sitting in a circle with a shaman, the ayahuasca tea in her hands, her eyes wide with wonder as she journeyed into the unknown, a journey I hoped would bring her back to me, enriched, not altered. But as the days ticked by, a quiet, dread began to settle in, a premonition I couldn't shake, the kind that lingers like a shadow on a sunny day, whispering that things were about to change in ways I couldn't predict. The absence of LRA pulsed, a void weaving through our home, its silver unease glinting as it grew, a presence that wasn't just a trip, wasn't just a weight, but something alive, something that growled with a hunger for change, whispering promises of darkness as I held my breath. LRA returned from Bolivia, a shell of her former self, her strange behavior escalating from eerie silence to horrifying habits, turning our once warm apartment into a place of dread. I kept the apartment running during LRA's 2-week absence, tending to her plants and keeping our space tidy, eagerly awaiting her return and the stories she'd bring. I kept the apartment running for her 2-week absence, and then when she came back I was ready to hear everything. She texted me that she was catching a cab from the airport, and about an hour later, the door creaked open, LRA stepping inside with her bag slung over one shoulder. LRA texted me saying that she was about to catch a cab home from the airport. Then about an hour later, the door creaked open, and she stepped inside with her bag slung over one shoulder. I'd expected her to look relaxed, refreshed, maybe with a healthy tan, but instead her hair was a tangled, unwashed mess, her skin chalky as if the sun hadn't touched her in weeks. I'd expected her to return looking relaxed and refreshed, with obviously a nice healthy tan, and instead her hair was a tangled, unwashed mess, and her skin looked chalky, like the sun hadn't touched her for the whole 2 weeks. When I asked if she'd had fun, she didn't smile, just dropped her bag by the door and looked at me, or rather through me, with a flat, distant voice saying it was intense, before shuffling to her room and closing the door. When I asked her if she had fun, she didn't even smile. LRA dropped the bag by the door and then looked at me, except it didn't feel like she was looking at me, more like through me or past me. In this flat, distant voice, she simply said, "It was intense," and then she shuffled to her room and closed the door behind her. That was the first sign something was terribly wrong. LRA had always been sociable, the kind who'd flop down beside me to ramble about her bookstore shift or her latest sketch, but now she was distant, a ghost of her former self. And that was the first sign that something was clearly off. LRA had always been very sociable, the kind of person who'd flop down next to me and ramble on about her shift at the bookstore or the new sketch that she was working on. But after her trip to Bolivia, she seemed distant. I chalked it up to exhaustion or jet lag, but after another Google search, I learned the ayahuasca retreat might have been rougher than I'd thought, involving purging, vomiting, and hours of mental unraveling, which explained her shell-shocked demeanor. And I told myself it was exhaustion or jet lag or something like that. But after another Google search, I discovered that the retreat might have been rougher than expected, and I read about the purging, the vomiting, and the hours upon hours, of feeling like your mind was unspooling, and then thought, geez, no wonder she's acting so shell-shocked. I figured she just needed time to settle in, so I gave her space, hoping she'd bounce back soon. She probably just needed time to settle in, so I figured that I'd give her the space that she needed. But a week passed, and LRA didn't recover. She became eerily quiet, answering in short, clipped words, never initiating conversations, her sketches no longer appearing on the fridge, and the plants I'd watered began to wilt, unnoticed by her. But time didn't seem to fix anything. A week passed, but LRA didn't snap back. She got super quiet, like she didn't answer me if I asked something, but only in short, clipped words, and she never started conversations anymore. Her sketches stopped. Showing up on the fridge, and the plants that I'd watered while she was gone started to wilt, but it was like she didn't even notice. I worried she'd received bad news, or that something had gone wrong in Bolivia. But when I asked, she brushed me off, saying she didn't want to talk about it, leaving me to assume she'd open up when ready. I started to worry that she might have gotten some bad news, or that a trip to Bolivia had gone wrong somehow. But when I asked, LRA said that she didn't want to talk about it. I figured my suspicions were correct, and that whatever it was, she'd talk about it when and if she was ready to. I thought she'd feel better in a few days, but I was wrong. Things only got stranger. I also figured it would be a matter of days at most before LRA started to feel better, but I was wrong, and things only got weirder. LRA had always been a vegetarian, a talented cook who'd make stir-fries with peppers and tofu or salads with nuts, leaving bowls of apples and mangoes on the counter, a passion for healthy eating we shared. For as long as I'd known her, LRA had always been a vegetarian. She was a great cook. She'd make stir-fries with peppers and tofu or big salads with nuts sprinkled on top. I'd regularly find bowls of fruit on the counter, mostly apples or mangoes. And I'd loved living with someone who shared my passion for healthy eating. But less than 2 weeks after her return, I found raw beef in the fridge, a shocking discovery that made me question my own memory until I realized it was hers, prompting a gasp of disbelief. But then, just less than 2 weeks after LRA got back from her ayahuasca retreat, the raw beef started appearing. And the first time I saw some, I had almost a gaslight moment where I thought, I don't remember buying ground beef. And then when I realized that it was LRA's, I think I actually kind of gasped out loud. When I asked about her sudden change, her tone was flat, her shoulders shrugging as she said, "Time for a change, I guess." A response so unlike her that it sent a chill down my spine. I asked her why the sudden change of heart, and I never forgot how flat her tone of voice sounded as she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Time for a change, I guess." I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a set of kitchen knives, only to find one missing, a small betrayal that echoed the growing unease I felt as LRA's behavior shifted. The apartment, once a haven of warmth and creativity, now felt cold, the air heavy with an unspoken tension that grew with each passing day. I'd wake up at 5:30 for my shifts, the coffee pot sitting unused, a stark reminder of the rhythm we'd lost, and I'd find myself lingering at the shop after hours, dreading the return to a space that no longer felt like home. LRA's room became a mystery. Her door often closed, the faint sound of her movements within a constant reminder of the stranger she'd become. I'd pass by the fridge, now a source of dread, the sight of raw beef a jarring contrast to the bowls of fruit that once adorned our counter, a symbol of the life we'd shared. I tried to focus on the familiar, my work, the regulars at the coffee shop, the routine of steaming milk and wiping counters, but the unease followed me, a shadow that clung to every moment, whispering that something was terribly wrong. I'd always been the practical one, the one who kept things together. But now I felt adrift, unsure of how to reach the friend I'd lost to whatever had happened in Bolivia. I'd lie awake at night, replaying her distant words, her hollow gaze, the way she seemed to look through me, as if I were a ghost in her world, a world I no longer understood. The plants continued to wilt, their leaves curling in neglect, a mirror to the decay I felt creeping into our home, a decay I feared was only the beginning of something far worse. The shift in LRA pulsed, a darkness weaving through our space, its silver dread glinting as it spread. A presence that wasn't just a change, wasn't just a return, but something alive, something that growled with a hunger for horror, whispering promises of terror as I watched her unravel. LRA's descent spiraled into a nightmarish climax, her horrifying actions forcing me to flee, leaving behind a shattered friendship and a haunting mystery that lingers to this day. I couldn't stress enough how unlike LRA her new behavior was, and by that point I was deeply worried, especially when I saw how she ate the raw beef, not cooked but straight from the package with her hands, often late at night. I cannot stress how unlike LRA that was, and by that time I was really starting to worry about her. But then I saw how she ate it. She didn't cook the ground beef she bought. She ate it raw with her hands. She developed this habit of doing it late. At night too. One night I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and heard the fridge door creak. Peeking into the kitchen, I saw moonlight pouring through the blinds, casting a grid of shadows, and LRA standing at the window, staring at the moon, her figure swaying slightly as I bolted back to my room. Like this one time when I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, I was heading back to bed when I heard the creak of the fridge door coming from the apartment's kitchen and sitting area. It was almost 3 a.m., and when I peeked around the door, I saw the moon was kind of pouring through the blinds, turning the floor into this sort of grid of shadows, and there was LRA too standing at the window, just staring up at the moon. I stood there watching her silently, until she swayed slightly, and then I sort of bolted back to my room. The next day I asked if she was okay, but she insisted she was fine, a lie I could see through, and I resolved to involve her family for an intervention if she got any worse. And the next day I once again asked if she was okay, or if there was anything she wanted to talk about. But she told me what I'm now quite certain was a lie, and she said she was fine. I told myself that she even got so much as a tiny bit worse. I was probably going to try and get her family involved and organize some kind of intervention. Then the insects appeared. On a Saturday afternoon as I made toast, I heard a crunch and turned to see LRA at the table with a mason jar of live. Crickets plucking one out and eating it, the sound making my stomach drop as I fled the kitchen. And then the next thing I knew, the insect started appearing. It was a Saturday afternoon and I was in the kitchen making toast when I heard a crunch behind me and turned. LRA was sitting at the table, a mason jar in front of her, and inside of it were live crickets. I watched in horror as she reached inside. The cricket's legs were scrabbling against the glass, and she swallowed what was in her mouth and started speaking. A few days later, it was beetles, big shiny black ones which she ate by the sink, and when I gagged, she calmly said she'd learned things about herself in Bolivia and wasn't about to let me dictate her diet, her newfound confrontation chilling me. A few days later, it was beetles, these big shiny black ones. I found her eating them standing by the sink, and this time I gagged the sound slipping out before I could stop it. She didn't react. She just kept eating. But when I demanded to know what had gotten into her, she swallowed what was in her mouth and started speaking. She told me that she learned a thing or two about herself down in Bolivia and that she decided to make some changes. And if I didn't want to try out her new diet, that was fine. But I wasn't about to dictate what she could and could not eat in her own apartment. She didn't sound threatening or anything, but again, seeing LRA act, even remotely, confrontation was so unlike her that it actually freaked me out. The apartment no longer felt like ours. It was hers, her room reeking of wet dirt and rot, her hygiene deteriorating as she stopped showering, her hair clumping into greasy knots, her weight dropping alarmingly. And before long, the apartment didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like hers, like she'd claimed it, and her room started to stink. A very thick, earthy smell, like wet dirt and rot, and she stopped showering. Her hair was clumping into these greasy, knots and her clothes kind of hung off of her. She started to lose weight too. I wanted to ask what she'd seen in Bolivia, but fear stopped me and I began locking my flimsy bedroom door, lying awake with my phone under my pillow, listening to her pace outside. I wanted to ask what happened down there, what she'd seen in that jungle. But every time I tried, something stopped me. I started locking my bedroom door. It was a very flimsy door, the kind that you could probably pop open with a credit card, but it made me feel just that little bit safer. I'd lie there, my phone under my pillow, listening to LRA pacing around outside. Work became my escape. The coffee shop a lifeline where I could avoid the unraveling nightmare at home, lingering after, shifts to delay my return, where LRA would often be staring at the moon. Work became my lifeline. 8 hours at the coffee shop, steaming milk, wiping counters and chatting with regulars who didn't know that my roommate was unraveling back home. Then come the end of the day, I'd linger after my shift, nursing a cold latte and delaying the walk home. But I had to go back eventually. And when I did there, she'd be sitting or standing by the window and either waiting for or staring at the moon. She started covering all the mirrors with towels or turning them to the wall, and I found deep scratches on the bathroom door. Her sketchbooks vandalized with torn pages and eerie charcoal scribbles that unnerved me. The next thing I remember is how she started covering up all the mirrors. One day I came home to find every single one in the apartment draped with towels or turned to face the wall. And that was also the day that I found scratches on the bathroom. After these deep gouges, like she'd been clawing at it with something. She vandalized her own sketchbooks too. The ones that she used to fill with all of her pretty drawings, pages had been torn out or crumpled up, and the ones that remained were covered in these strange charcoal scribbles that creeped me out just to look at them. I knew she needed urgent help, planning to confront her the next day, but by then it was too late. I came home to a dark apartment, the air thick with a wet, coppery smell, and found LRA sitting cross-legged in the TV room, a kitchen knife. In one hand, a flap of her own skin in the other, her face peeled back as she said, "I need to see who's underneath." And that was the point that I realized that she needed help, very urgent help too. And the next day, once I got home from work, I was going to try and talk to her about getting some. If that didn't work, it was then time for plan B, the intervention. But the horrible irony of all of this is that by the time I actually decided to act, it was already too late. The next evening it was dark when I arrived home from work. Then when I unlocked the door, I walked into the apartment, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was sort of this wet and coppery smell, heavier than the beef had ever been. The apartment was dark, so I figured no one was home, but when I flipped the light switch, there was LRA sitting in the middle of the TV room. Or at least what was left of her. She was sitting cross-legged, our big kitchen knife in one hand, a flap of her own skin in the other. She'd peeled it back from her face, starting at her forehead, and pulled it down like a mask. She looked at me, the raw flesh of her forehead glistening as blood dripped onto her thighs. And then with lips that were streaked with red, she told me, "I need to see who's underneath." I dropped my bag, ran to my room, locked the door and called 911, hearing her mutter and scrape the knife outside until the cops arrived, their shouts followed by a feral snarl, the sound of bare feet and 2 gunshots, leaving a silence more terrifying than the chaos. I dropped my bag and ran screaming as I went. I made it to my room, slammed the door, and then pressed my back against it after locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. Then I dialed 911 and told the dispatcher what was happening, and as I spoke, I could hear her out there in the hallway. That knife sounded like it was scraping against something, and she was muttering louder and louder, and then it stopped, replaced by a low, keening sound, like she'd finally realized what she was doing or had only now just started to feel the pain of what she'd done to her face. I slid down on the floor, my knees pulled up with my finger in one ear and the dispatcher in the other, and just waited. I was shaking, but thankfully the cops got there fast. I heard the front door burst open as a boot hit the frame, and then after the distinct sound of the 2 cops shouting some commands, I heard this feral, inhuman snarl before the slap, slap, slap of bare feet on hardwood floor. There was another shout, a command to stop, and then 2 shots, sharp and loud. The shots were terrifying, but the silence that hung in the air afterwards was somehow even worse. I fled to my friend Mia's, crashing on her couch, and later packed up my things. breaking the lease as the cops blamed LRA's psychotic break on the ayahuasca, a haunting end that still keeps me checking mirrors at night, fearing what I might see. By the time I unlocked the door, 2 EMTs were zipping LRA up into a bag. Her face, or what was left of it, was turned toward me with one eye still open, cloudy and still. One of the cops asked if I was okay. I nodded in the moment, but I wasn't. I was more shaken up than I'd ever been in my whole life. I didn't stay, I couldn't. I grabbed my keys and my phone and drove to my friend Mia's place across town. She opened the door in pajamas and took one look at me and pulled me inside. I crashed on her couch and then told her everything in bits and pieces. My friend didn't say much. She just gave me a hug and handed me a blanket and let me sleep, after assuring me that everything would be fine. A few days later, once the cops finished with the scene, we went back to the apartment, me, Mia, and her boyfriend, and the ladder's truck, and we packed all of my stuff up in under an hour, and the landlord didn't fight me when I broke the lease. He'd already seen the blood, stains on the hardwood. I live with Mia now. Her spare room is small, just a twin bed and a dresser, but it's mine, and sleep was very tough for a while. I'd have nightmares about LRA crickets and beetles crawling out of her open mouth before her, whole face split open, and I'd wake up sweating and then lie there till the sun came up, wondering what she saw in that jungle and what she brought back with her. The cops called it a psychotic break and blamed the ayahuasca. I read for myself that it happens sometimes, and I guess it does make sense. But there are times at night that I still keep the lights on, and I still lock my bedroom door, and I still check the mirror before I sleep, just to make sure that it's still me looking back. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a crystal pendant, hoping it would bring calm, only to find it cracked, a bitter irony that mirrored the fractured piece LRA's descent had left behind. The apartment, once a sanctuary of shared laughter and creativity, was now a place of nightmares. The bloodstains on the hardwood a permanent scar I couldn't erase from my memory. I'd moved in with Mia, her small spare room a safe haven, but the echoes of that night followed me. The image of LRA's mutilated face burned into my mind. Her words, "I need to see who's underneath," a haunting refrain that played in my dreams. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the sound of crickets and beetles a phantom echo, my heart racing as I checked the mirror, fearing I'd see something other than my own reflection, a fear born of the horror I'd witnessed. The cop's explanation, a psychotic break induced by ayahuasca, made sense, but it didn't erase the questions that lingered, the mystery of what LRA had seen in that jungle, what she'd brought back with her, a darkness that had consumed her and nearly taken me with it. I tried to rebuild my life, my shifts at the coffee shop a grounding routine, but the nights were the hardest, the darkness a canvas for my fears, the locked door a flimsy barrier against the memories that haunted me. Pasadena, with its sunny streets and blooming jacarandas, felt like a different world now, a world I could no longer fully inhabit. The shadow of that night a constant companion, a reminder of how quickly joy can turn to terror. I'd lost more than a roommate that night. I'd lost a friend, a home, and a piece of myself, a piece I feared I'd never reclaim, as the mystery of LRA's unraveling lingered like a ghost, whispering in the quiet moments, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. The horror of that night pulsed, a trauma weaving through my life, its silver scar glinting as it lingered, a presence that wasn't just a memory, wasn't just a loss, but something alive, something that growled with a hunger for answers, whispering promises of fear as I tried to move on. The haunting on Mount Vernon Street. After a devastating fire, I thought Mount Vernon Street would be my sanctuary, until whispers of an unseen presence began to unravel my new beginning. My name is Athena, and in the summer of 2020 I launched a home bakery business to escape the monotony of being furloughed from my corporate job, a venture that became my salvation in more ways than I could have imagined. My name is Athena, and I started my home bakery business during the summer of 2020. I was furloughed from my job and the boredom was killing me, so I took up baking as a way of keeping myself occupied. Baking was my way of managing stress, though. I always produced more than I could consume, so I delivered the surplus to family and friends, using it as an excuse to get out of my tiny apartment and reconnect with the world. It was definitely a way of managing stress too, because I always made way too much for one person, but then delivering baked goods to family and friends always made for a great excuse to get out and stretch my legs. I initially thought their compliments were just polite gestures, but when a friend suggested I could turn my baking into a lockdown side hustle, I began to see the potential in my newfound passion. Whenever they gave me compliments on the things I delivered, I figured they were just being kind and showing gratitude. But when one friend told me that I could potentially earn money by turning my baking into a lockdown side hustle, I got to thinking. My kitchen was far from ideal, the counter barely wide enough for a cutting board, but I made it work, setting up social media profiles and posting photos of my best brownies, blondies and pies, asking friends to share for maximum exposure. And at the time, the kitchen in my apartment was tiny with the counter barely wide enough for a cutting board. But I made it work. I set up a few social media profiles, uploaded a dozen photos of my best brownies, blondies and pies, and then asked the right people to share my page for the maximum audience. I doubted it would succeed against the backdrop of fast delivery services, but I was mistaken. There was a surprising demand for locally baked goods, and my orders doubled, then tripled, then nearly quadrupled within weeks. Part of me believed that there was no way that it would take off, not with all the super-fast delivery services that people could use with just a few taps on their phone. But I was wrong, majorly wrong. And I discovered that in a world of faceless online middlemen offering discounted merchandise made half the world away, there was a huge demand for locally baked bread cakes, pies and pastries. The first week was slow but promising, and the easy scheduling helped me figure out the best methods of running my kitchen. But then over the week that followed, word of mouth and grassroots advertising resulted in my orders doubling, then tripling, then almost quadrupling over the course of 8 very productive days. By the third week, I had a waiting list, my days filled with prep, proofing and baking, transforming from idle to overwhelmed. But the extra cash and the joy of busy hands made it all worthwhile. And by week 3, I was having to place potential customers on a waiting list because my whole schedule was filled with either prep proofing or baking. And I'd gone from bored out of my mind to barely having a minute to myself. But busy hands meant happy hands, especially once all that extra cash landed in my pocket. I found a deep love for baking and running my own business. The aroma of yeast and sugar a constant in my home, and the genuine delight of my customers brought a fulfillment I'd never known in my corporate life. I liked making the extra cash, and I liked having something to keep me from going crazy. But I quickly realized that I love baking and running my own business more than anything I'd ever done before. Each and every day my apartment was filled with the warm, yeasty scent of rising dough baking bread or caramelized sugar. Then, unlike my job in corporate, I got to see the results of my hard work right there in front of me, while the enthusiasm my customers exhibited was satisfying in ways that I never thought possible. After 2 months, I realized that a 6-day schedule and a slight price increase would allow me to quit my job and bake full-time, a decision that brought me unprecedented happiness, until a fire in October 2021 turned my world to ashes. 2 months. I did a little calculating and realized if I worked on a 6-day schedule and raised my prices by just a small percentage, I could actually quit my job and bake full-time. Well, long story short, that's what I did. And for just over a year following, I was happier and more fulfilled than I'd ever been in my entire life. But then, right when everything was going smoothly for the first time in a long time, the fire came. I was jolted awake by the fire alarm, the smell of burning filling my senses as black smoke seeped under my door. I grabbed my shoes but fled barefoot into the smoky hallway, escaping as flames consumed the building, leaving my apartment a charred wreck by morning. It was the middle of the night in October of 2021, and I was dreaming of sourdough starters. I had bubbling on my counter when the fire alarm suddenly woke me up. I fumbled for my phone just as I smelled burning. And then, seconds later, I saw black, smoke curling under my apartment's front door. I grabbed my shoes out of instinct, but I was so scared that I didn't bother putting them on. I ran barefoot into the smoky hallway and then stumbled out onto the street, coughing as flames licked up the side of the building. And by morning, the section of the building containing my apartment was a charred ruin with blackened beams jutting from scorched brickwork that still dripped with hose water. Everything I'd built, my mixer, baking sheets, clothes, books, was destroyed, and I stood in the dawn's chill, holding only my phone and shoes, grappling with the reality of starting over, until my mom offered her guest room in Somerville as a temporary refuge. And everything I owned was gone. My mixer, my baking sheets, my clothes, my books, all burned or soaked beyond saving, and I stood there in the dark of the early morning, clutching my phone and shoes, and wondered what the hell was I going to do. But as usual, Mum had a solution. She lived in the same split-level house up in Somerville that I'd grown up in, one with faded yellow siding and a well-tended front yard, and the guest room still had my old twin bed. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd purchased a second-hand oven for my bakery, only to discover it wouldn't heat properly, a subtle foreshadowing of the devastation that now left me with nothing but memories of what I'd lost. The fire had stripped me bare, the scent of smoke lingering in my hair as I stood on the street, watching firefighters douse the last of the flames, the blackened skeleton of my apartment, a cruel reminder of how quickly everything could change. Somerville was a bittersweet return, my mum's house a haven of familiarity with its creaky floors and the faint hum of her old refrigerator, but it also felt like a surrender, a step back from the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. I spent those early days in a haze, my hands itching to knead dough, to roll out pie crusts, to do anything that felt normal, but all I had left was the ache of loss and the determination to rebuild. My customers sent messages of support, their kindness a small light in the darkness, but the absence of my kitchen was a gaping wound, a reminder of how much I'd depended on that space to define my new life. I knew I needed to find a new place, somewhere I could restart my business, a space that could hold the dreams I refused to let die, even as the ashes of my past still smoldered in my mind. I threw myself into the search, my mum's living room, becoming my temporary office as I scoured listings, the sound of her knitting needles clicking softly in the background, a strange comfort against the uncertainty that loomed ahead. The ashes of my past pulsed, a grief weaving through my resolve, its silver sting glinting as it lingered, a presence that wasn't just a loss, wasn't just a fire, but something alive, something that growled with a hunger for rebirth, whispering promises of shadows as I sought a new home. Mount Vernon Street promised a fresh start with its historic charm, but an insidious sickness began to seep into my life, hinting at a sinister force tied to the house's forbidden third floor. My mum offered me her guest room in Somerville for as long as I needed, especially if I could find a place with a larger kitchen to boost my bakery's output, a practical solution I appreciated as I worked to rebuild my life. She told me that I could stay as long as I needed if it meant finding the right apartment. We'd already talked it over, and I'd mentioned how if I found somewhere with a large and well-equipped kitchen, then there was potential for a huge increase in turnover when it came to my baking business. I was grateful for her patience while I rebuilt. I resumed baking with new supplies, and my customers didn't mind the change of location, driving to my mum's driveway to pick up their orders, allowing me to slowly piece my business back together. So, after picking up baking supplies and a few home essentials, I got back to work. Customers didn't care where I baked so long as the bread was good. They'd pull up to Mum's driveway, I'd hand over their orders, and life kind of limped along. But I knew I couldn't stay indefinitely. I needed my own space, central enough for clients across the city, with a kitchen spacious enough for my growing business. So I spent weeks searching listings until I found one on Mount Vernon Street, just north of Boston Common. But I couldn't stay forever. I needed a place of my own, somewhere central enough that clients from across the city could reach me with a kitchen big enough to handle my growing business. And I spent weeks hunting, sitting on my mom's couch laptop, balanced on my knees, scrolling through listings until my eyes literally hurt. Some places were too small, and others were just too far out, and a few were perfect, but priced beyond my reach. Then one afternoon, as rain was tapping against the living room windows, I found it a listing for a place on Mount Vernon Street, just north of Boston Common. I remembered the area from my teenage years working at a pizza joint on Charles Street. Mount Vernon was a street of historic elegance, its brownstones glowing with a timeless warmth, some adorned with ornate ironwork, others with wide windows. That captured the day's last light, a neighborhood that exuded quiet prestige. I knew that area from my teenage years, when I had a job slinging pizzas at a joint on Charles Street. Mount Vernon Street was elegant and historic, lined with brownstones that glowed red-brown in the sunlight, and some had balconies with curling ironwork and others had wide windows that caught the last of the day's light. I loved it, and it was a major step up a neighborhood that breathed old wealth and quiet pride. The listing promised 2 floors with full amenities at a surprisingly affordable rent, but it came with a condition. Tenants had to adhere to strict rules, which I assumed meant standard restrictions like no parties or pets, rules I was fine with given my focus on baking and early mornings. While the listing offered 2 floors full amenities and rent that didn't make me flinch, there was, however, a catch, a single line tacked on at the end. Potential tenants must be prepared to follow a strict set of terms and conditions, and I assumed it was just standard stuff. No parties, no smoking, maybe a ban on pets, and that was all fine by me. My life was flower ovens, super early mornings, not late-night chaos. I called immediately, and a woman named Evelyn answered with a refined tone, explaining that the house belonged to her family, who were seeking a tenant to share it with her elderly cousin Ethel, a frail woman with a rare condition that kept her confined to the 3rd floor. So I called the number just minutes after spotting the listing. A woman answered. Her voice was very polished, and then after confirming I was calling about the apartment, she went into a big explanation. And after introducing herself as Evelyn, she explained that the house belonged to her family, who were looking for a tenant to share with her elderly cousin Ethel, who had some rare condition that kept her frail and confined. I'd have the first 2 floors to myself, kitchen, living room, bedroom, but the 3rd floor was strictly off limits. No knocking, no talking, no stepping foot up there, or I'd face immediate eviction, a rule Evelyn emphasized as non-negotiable. I'd have the first 2 floors to myself, including a kitchen, a living room and a bedroom. But the 3rd floor where Ethel lived apparently was a no-go zone. No knocking, no talking, no stepping foot up there. Break the rules, and I guess I'd be out in the streets, lease terminated instantly. She clarified that this wasn't about control, but about protecting Ethel's health and dignity in her final days. I wouldn't need to care for her. Nurses handled that, and we might never meet, an arrangement that seemed unusual, but worth the price for such a prime location. Evelyn stressed that it wasn't about pettiness or control. It was about preserving Ethel's health and dignity, and what little time that she probably had left. I wouldn't have to look after her. Nurses and assistants came and did that. And outside, of calling in the event of an emergency, there was a chance Ethel and I might never cross paths. The setup sounded odd, but I kept hearing run of the house in my head. 2 floors in a prime spot for the price of 1 bedroom. It was just way too good to pass up. I arranged to see the house the next day, and it was even more breathtaking than I'd envisioned. A grand brick structure with a weathered facade, its front steps smoothed by time, and an oak door with a lion's head brass knocker, exuding an air of history and permanence. I told Evelyn I wanted to see it, and then we set up a time for the next day. When I arrived, the house was even more than I'd pictured it. It loomed on Mount Vernon Street, and its brick facade weathered but very stately, and the kind of place that had seen centuries pass without even blinking. The front steps were worn smooth. The door was a heavy slab of oak, complete with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. I loved it. The first floor opened into a grand living room with a fireplace, its mantel etched with intricate carvings. And the kitchen was a baker's paradise, vast, with a professional-grade oven, a marble island, and endless storage, everything I dreamed of for my business. And inside, the first floor opened into a wide living room, a fireplace dominating this one wall, its mantel carved with vines that looked older than the city itself, and the rest of the house was just as opulent. But when I saw the kitchen, when I fell in love. It was a dream, spacious with a gas range, a butcher block island and cabinets that stretched to the ceiling. The second floor featured a bedroom with a bay window overlooking the street and a small study for my paperwork. Evelyn, A stern woman with white hair guided me through, her demeanor softening when I mentioned my bakery, clearly relieved I wasn't a troublemaker. Upstairs, the second floor had a bedroom with a bay window overlooking the street, plus a small office that I could use for paperwork. Evelyn met me at the door, this very thin woman with a flash of white hair and a face etched with very stern lines. And she didn't smile, but she didn't glare either. She led me through the house, her steps very slow, very measured, asking about my plans. When I mentioned the bakery, her eyes kind of softened, and she seemed relieved that I wasn't looking to turn the place into some kind of party house. I signed the lease that day. Evelyn handed me the keys, restated the rules about Ethel, and left me to settle in. The house's grandeur filling me with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt since the fire. I signed the lease that afternoon. Evelyn handed me the keys, repeated the rules about Ethel, and then left me to settle in. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a set of baking pans, only to find them dented, a minor disappointment compared to the hope this house inspired, though a faint unease about the third floor lingered beneath my excitement. The house on Mount Vernon Street was a masterpiece of history, its brick walls steeped in stories I could almost feel as I walked its halls, the creak of the hardwood floors a quiet song beneath my feet. I set up my kitchen immediately, the marble island becoming my new workstation, the oven's warmth a comforting presence as I baked my first batch of sourdough in my new home. The neighborhood was a dream, the cobblestone streets lined with gas lamps that flickered at dusk, casting a golden glow over the brownstones, a scene so picturesque it felt like stepping into a painting. My customers loved the new location, the central spot making deliveries a breeze, and I found myself humming as I worked, the rhythm of baking a balm for the scars of the fire. But there was a heaviness to the house, a weight in the air that I couldn't quite place, a sensation that grew stronger whenever I passed the staircase to the third floor, its dark wood a silent barrier I was forbidden to cross. I pushed the feeling aside, focusing on my work, but it lingered like a whisper in the back of my mind, a quiet warning that this house held secrets I might not be ready to uncover. The grandeur of Mount Vernon pulsed, a promise weaving through my days, its golden glow glinting as it beckoned, a presence that wasn't just a home, wasn't just a space, but something alive, something that hummed with a hunger for secrets, whispering promises of unease as I settled in. An eerie hum from the third floor unveiled a chilling truth, forcing me to flee Mount Vernon Street and confront a malevolent force that had nearly consumed me. The first few weeks at Mount Vernon Street were a dream come true. My kitchen buzzed with activity, the oven's warmth filling the house with the scent of fresh bread, the quiet a perfect canvas for my work, and I rarely thought of Ethel, the mysterious tenant above. The first few weeks were good, better than good. Even I had the kitchen set up. My mixer was humming on the island with flour, dusting the counters as I worked, and the house was quiet, but I relished that. And sometimes I'd even forget that Ethel was even there at all. But then I heard her, a faint labored breathing echoing through the ceiling late one night. A sound so distinct it jolted me from my recipe notes, reminding me of her frail condition and the strict rules, so I tried to ignore it. I heard her, once maybe 2 weeks, in a wet rattling cough that drifted down from the third floor, and it kind of startled me. The sound cutting through all that stillness, but I just sort of brushed it off. She was sick, and that's why the rules were there. And after that, I barely thought about her. My business consumed my focus, and the house soon felt like my own, until I began to feel unwell, a creeping fatigue that seeped into my limbs, leaving me sluggish, my hands trembling as I rolled dough, which I attributed to overwork. My business occupied my mind almost constantly, and before long the house felt like it was all mine, at least until I started to feel sick too. It came on kind of slow, a tiredness that slowly settled into my bones. I'd wake up sluggish with my legs feeling heavy, and no amount of coffee seemed to shake it. I blamed the hours kneading dough at dawn, baking through the afternoon, packing orders late into the night. Even after cutting back my hours, the exhaustion deepened. I'd collapse into bed after a short baking session, waking up feeling as if I hadn't slept, my skin growing pale, my appetite vanishing, symptoms I tried to dismiss as stress from the fire's aftermath. But even after I scaled back my operation to give myself some rest, it seemed to get worse. I'd end up napping on the couch, the oven timer ticking in the background, but I'd wake up even more exhausted than before. My jeans were starting to loosen around my waist and my face started looking sharper in the mirror as the weight melted off of me, and I told myself it was stress. The months of grind and stress just catching up with me. Then my vision began to blur, my nails grew brittle and began to crack, and a customer complained of a strange metallic taste in their pie, forcing me to face the reality that something was wrong, my hands trembling as I noticed how frail they'd become. But then my hair started to fall out. I'd find clumps in the shower, dark strands clogging the drain more tangled in my brush each morning. My period stopped coming too, which is kind of TMI, which at first I tried to pin on the same exhaustion. Excuse maybe even just me not eating enough. But when a customer called voice was very tight with anger, saying that they found one of my fingernails in their banana bread, I couldn't ignore that anymore. I looked at my hands, saw brittle yellowing, nails and how one was missing entirely, and then felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. I visited a doctor the next day, a gruff man with a clipboard who asked about my habits and, upon learning of my new home, suggested that old houses could harbor hidden dangers like mold or lead, ordering blood work and advising me to stay elsewhere if my condition worsened. And obviously I went to the doctor the next day. He was some stocky guy with graying hair and a clipboard that he kept scribbling on, and he asked about my diet, my sleeping habits, and what I did for work. But I also made sure to tell him about the fire, the move, and my new home. He kind of was just tapping his pen and said, old buildings can sometimes hide things, be it mold in the walls, lead in the pipes, or even arsenic in the green covers of antique books. And he ordered blood work and told me to stay someplace else for a few days if things got any worse. Stay with a relative, he said, or check into a hotel and see if the symptoms fade. I returned to my mum's that night, and she was horrified by my gaunt appearance, my eyes sunken, my skin ashen. But after 3 days, my strength returned, prompting me to call Evelyn, who seemed oddly dismissive, citing the lease terms and suggesting I needed proof to break it. I nodded, promised I would, and then left with a slip for the lab. I went back to my mum's that night. She opened the door, took one look at me and just gasped. "Oh my God, you look terrible," she said. I must have looked skeletal compared to the last time I'd seen her. I was pale. I had huge bags under my eyes and my hair looked pretty patchy and dull. I was a far cry from the girl that put on a little weight thanks to getting sugar high on her own supply, and I was scared that I'd get worse. But after 3 days of connellising in her guest room, I felt so much better. The nausea lifted, and when my strength crept back, I called Evelyn and told her I thought something in that house was making me sick, and she expressed her sympathy. But there was this very strangeness to her voice. She reminded me of the lease, how breaking it without proof would mean lawyers and fees. Subletting was an option, and she was more than happy to consider a doctor's opinion. But at the end of the day we had an agreement. I should have stayed away, but I returned for one night to confirm my suspicions, noticing a faint electric hum in the air, a vibration I couldn't place, which I dismissed as the house's old wiring, though I now believe it was something far more sinister. I should have stayed away, I know that now, but I loved that place so much that I talked myself into going back. Just for one more night I'd test it, prove it was the house, and if I felt worse, then I'd know for certain that I needed to leave. I drove back to Mount Vernon Street, and then the moment I stepped inside, the air had this very stale heavy, with a sort of faint metallic quality that I'd never detected before. I told myself it was some kind of cleaning product Ethel's nurses had used, and now I think I know different. By evening, the fatigue returned, and as I sat in the living room, a low resonant hum emanated from the 3rd floor. Not a human sound, but a deep, pulsing vibration that seemed to seep into my bones, making my head throb with an unnatural pressure. Stale air and chemicals or not, I resigned myself to stay at least one night, so I set my bag down and started a batch of dough to keep my hands busy. But by the evening, the nausea was back. I knew then that I'd be leaving in the morning for certain. But I was so exhausted that I thought driving might be dangerous until I'd slept and there was daylight. So I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, feet dragging with each step, when suddenly I heard the sound of singing. It came from the 3rd floor, this clear voice that cut through the silence. But it wasn't the voice of an old dying woman. It was young alive, sounding out a melody that I didn't recognize. The hum grew louder, a frequency that made my vision blur. And I realized it wasn't Ethel, it couldn't be. A realization that sent me fleeing, grabbing my bag and running to my car, driving back to my mum's where I collapsed, my body racked with fever, as if something had tried to hold me there. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, my breath catching as I listened. The sound was soft but sharp, and at first I figured it was a recording, but then there was pauses, breaths, the faint waver of a living throat. It wasn't a recording. This was. Clearly a human Ethel was supposed to be bedridden. This husk of a person, so who the hell was up there singing? I remember my skin kind of prickling as I turned, shuffling back down the stairs before I grabbed my keys, my phone and my jacket, and then ran for the door. I didn't care about proof, about leases, about anything. I wasn't staying. And that night, after driving back to my mum's place, I got sicker than I'd ever been. I vomited until my throat was raw, and a blood vessel burst, in my eye leaving a red smear across the white area, and in the morning I looked into the mirror and saw a stranger. My cheeks looked completely sunken in my eyes, looked hollow, and my hair was thinning so badly that you could actually see my scalp. My mom helped me fight the lease, but tests found no toxins, forcing us to pay it out. Though I recovered after leaving, later seeing a flickering light in the third-floor window that confirmed something unnatural had been in that house, a presence I'd never fully understand. I broke down sobbing into my mom's arms and told her everything, the house, the sickness, the singing, and she held me tight and told me everything would be okay and that we'd fight the lease together. We'd get proof hire experts and force Evelyn to let me go, but it didn't work. Nothing did. My blood work came back normal. No toxins, no allergies, nothing to explain what was happening to me. And we paid a hazardous materials guy to check the house too. This gruff man with a toolbox and a clipboard, who spent hours testing the air, scraping paint and sniffing for mold, and he found nothing. The place is old, he said, but safe and up to code, and the lack of evidence meant Evelyn wouldn't budge, and we ended up paying out the full lease, thousands, that I didn't have borrowed from my mother and her boyfriend, just to be done with it. I moved back in with her, and within days I felt better again. The weight returned, my hair started to come back, and my energy was surging. Whatever was in that house, whatever it was doing to me, I guess it stopped, and I found a new place eventually, a much smaller apartment with a much smaller kitchen in the city's north end, and the bakery picked up life, steadied on, and I tried to move on. But that house, on Mount Vernon Street, wouldn't let me go, though. I remember lying awake some nights just staring at the ceiling, replaying this whole thing in my head. What was up on that third floor? Was it Ethel somehow defying her sickness? Or was it something else? I'd dig online sometimes late when I couldn't sleep, searching property records, old articles, anything about that house, and nothing turned up. No scandals, no death, just some blank slate, and the house just stood there, smug and silent, hoarding its secrets from me. And a few months back I drove by the house. I remember it was a cold January evening, and I was in the area for a delivery. I don't know why I did, curiosity maybe, or possibly out of some unconscious desire to face it. And the house looked the same, the brickwork glinting faintly in the early dusk with its windows dark and still. And I parked across the street. My engine was just idling, and I sat there watching. The place stayed still for a while, just another quiet house, on a quiet Boston street. And then suddenly I saw a shadow, quick and thin, pass by a third-floor window. My hands tightened on that wheel, and I floored it and sped away. I don't know what happened in that house, and I don't think I ever will either, but it wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong there, something that latched onto me and only let go when I fled. I'm safe now, happy even. But memories of what happened in that house back there still linger with me, and as long as that mystery persists, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully let go. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought an antique recipe book, only to find pages missing, a subtle echo of the gaps in my understanding of what had haunted that house, a mystery that left me forever changed. The hum from that night replayed in my mind, a sound that wasn't just a vibration, but a presence, something that had seeped into me, draining my life force with every pulse, a force I'd only escaped by fleeing. I rebuilt my bakery in a smaller apartment in Boston's North End, the scent of bread once more filling my days, but the memory of Mount Vernon Street lingered, a shadow that cast itself over every quiet moment. I'd wake in the night, my heart racing, half expecting to hear that hum again, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't natural, but something ancient, something that had lived in that house long before me. The flickering light I'd seen in the third-floor window that final night stayed with me, a confirmation that whatever had been there wasn't Ethel, wasn't anything I could comprehend, a force that had nearly claimed me. I tried to move on, my customers' smiles a reminder of why I baked, but the house on Mount Vernon Street remained a scar, a reminder of the unseen dangers that lurk in the places we call home, a mystery I'd never solve but would always carry. The echo of that hum pulsed, a terror weaving through my nights, its silver chill glinting as it lingered, a presence that wasn't just a sound, wasn't just a memory, but something alive, something that whispered with a hunger for my soul, whispering promises of dread as I lived on. The silent threat of Tommy. From the moment I met Tommy, I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined he'd turn my best friend's life into a nightmare. My name is Ryan, and I've been best friends with Danny since high school, a bond that carried us through countless late-night pizza runs, failed exams, and the chaotic transition into our early 20s. From the very first moment I met him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with my friend's new roommate, Tommy. It was late summer, and Danny had just moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment off campus, a place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, with peeling paint on the walls, a stairwell that reeked of mildew, and a hallway carpet stained with years of neglect. It was late summer, and my friend Danny had just moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment off campus. The building looked like it hadn't seen a fresh look of paint since the 80s, and the stairwell smelled bad, and the hallway carpet was stained. Despite its flaws, the rent was cheap, and its proximity to campus made it ideal for Danny, who only needed a spot to sleep and study while he finished his degree. But considering the rent and the proximity to campus, it was quite a fine considering. He needed nothing more than a place to sleep and study. I went over to help him unpack, hauling boxes up the creaky stairs, my shirt clinging to my back with sweat, when Tommy appeared, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, silently watching us. I went over to help him unpack, hauling boxes up the creaky stairs with my shirt sticking to my back, and that's when Tommy appeared. He was leaning against the kitchen counter, his arms were crossed, and he was just kind of watching us. He was a big guy, broad-shouldered with dark hair that hung just past his ears, his presence looming as Danny introduced us, saying, "This is Tommy. He's cool, just quiet." Though Tommy's quick nod and lack of a smile did little to ease my unease. He was a big guy, very wide too, with dark hair that hung just past his ears. Danny introduced me. "This is Tommy. He's cool, just quiet." Tommy nodded a quick jerk of his chin, but he didn't smile and he didn't say a word. I forced a smile, mumbled a hello and went back to moving Danny's stuff, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Tommy's gaze lingered on me, his silence more unsettling than any words could have been. I remember forcing a smile, mumbling hello, and went back to helping Danny move his stuff in, but I didn't like the look of him, and that never changed. Later, when Danny and I were alone grabbing pizza in my car, I brought it up saying, "Your roommate's kind of off, man," but Danny just laughed in his usual carefree way, brushing it off with, "Tommy's just not a big talker is all." Later, when we were alone grabbing pizza in the car, I brought it up. "Your roommate's kind of off, man," I told him. But Danny just laughed in that loud, careless way of his. "Oh, Tommy's just not a big talker is all," he replied. He admitted Tommy could be a bit weird, but argued that everyone has their quirks, a point I couldn't argue with, though my gut told me there was more to Tommy than just social awkwardness. I mean, I guess he's a little weird, but who isn't? He had a point, but I still wasn't sure. Something about Tommy just didn't sit right with me. I didn't want to nag Danny over what felt like a hunch, so I let it go, hoping I was wrong about his new roommate. But Danny was my best friend, and I didn't want to pester him over what amounted to just a gut feeling, so I let it go. To give you some context, Danny and I go way back, all the way to high school, where we bonded over our shared love of heavy metal and our mutual inability to wake up on time for class. And okay, time for a short history lesson before we keep going, Danny. And I went way back all the way to high school. Danny was the kind of guy who could sleep through anything, a trait that became a running joke between us, especially since cell phone alarms back then were just weak beeps that couldn't rouse him, even on a hard surface, because phones stopped vibrating when plugged in to charge. And for as long as I'd known him, he was the kind of guy who could sleep through a tornado. Then, since this all happened before super loud cell phone speakers were a thing, cell phone alarm clock functions were nothing more than tiny two-tone beeps looping over and over. Well, what about the vibration function, I hear you ask? Couldn't Danny just put his phone on a desk and any other hard surface, and then hear the super loud buzzing when the alarm went off? Not if he wanted to charge his phone overnight, 'cause back then, and I'm sure some engineer type will explain why in the comments, but some phones quit vibrating altogether whenever they were plugged into a charge. It was a minor inconvenience, so Danny bought an iPod docking station with an alarm clock feature, blasting Pantera to wake himself up, though half the time he still slept right through it, a quirk that always made me laugh. And it was super first world problems, I guess, but the solution was simple. He bought an iPod docking station one which featured an alarm clock function, and then he could blast himself with some Pantera music whenever he needed to wake up. However, that iPod station ended up being the punchline to half our jokes for a while, because even if he blasted himself with ear-splitting heavy metal music, he still didn't wake up half the time. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought an old speaker system for our high school band practice, only to find it blown out, a faint echo of the frustration I felt watching Danny's obliviousness to the warning signs around him. That apartment on the edge of campus was a far cry from the dorms we'd shared freshman year, its dim lighting and musty smell a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of our past. But Danny seemed unbothered, his easygoing nature a constant in the face of change. I helped him unpack his boxes, setting up his desk with textbooks and a small lamp. The same lamp we'd used to cram for finals years ago, its flickering bulb a reminder of simpler times. Tommy's presence, though, cast a shadow over the day. His silent observation from the kitchen a weight I couldn't shake, his eyes following us with an intensity that felt almost predatory. Danny, ever the optimist, didn't seem to notice, his laughter filling the small space as we reminisced about high school pranks and the time we got detention for sneaking into the gym after hours. I wanted to believe his assessment of Tommy, to trust that he was just a quiet guy with no ill intent, but my instincts screamed otherwise, a primal unease that gnawed at me as we finished setting up his room. The apartment itself felt like a relic, the walls paper-thin, the windows drafty, and the faint hum of traffic outside a constant backdrop to our conversation, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. I left that day with a promise to check in soon, but as I drove away, the image of Tommy leaning against the counter stayed with me, his silence louder than any words, a warning I wished I'd heeded sooner. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person chooses to live in such a rundown place, what kind of person watches without speaking, and what kind of person Danny had unknowingly invited into his life. The unease of that day pulsed, a suspicion weaving through my thoughts, its silver edge glinting as it grew, a presence that wasn't just a feeling, wasn't just a hunch, but something alive, something that growled with a hunger for truth, whispering promises of danger as I drove away. Tommy's unsettling behavior escalated, his silent resentment building into a storm I couldn't predict, leaving me to wonder if I could have saved Danny from the darkness brewing in their shared space. One time, Danny slept over at my place, setting up his iPod docking station to play Pantera's The Great Southern Trendkill, a track that opened with a guttural scream and blistering guitar riffs blaring at 7 a.m., startling me awake while Danny slept through it like a starfish on his inflatable mattress. It happened when he was sleeping over at my place one time, and he'd set up the docking station the night before to play music. It started blaring at like 7 odd a.m., and for the record, it was Pantera's song, The Great Southern Trendkill. So it opens up with a guy growl screaming blur at the top of his lungs. And it woke me up startled, and I looked across the room expecting Danny to wake up in a similarly abrupt fashion, but he was sprawled out in his inflatable mattress like some starfish, still snoring. I threw a pillow at him, laughing as he woke up annoyed. completely unfazed by the ear-splitting music, a moment that was funny then but later took on a darker significance. As the screaming stopped and the guitar riffs kicked in, I threw a pillow at him, and he woke up annoyed like there wasn't ear-melting loud music playing right next to his head. I thought it was funny at the time. Looking back, I wonder if there was a medical reason for Danny's deep sleep, perhaps an undiagnosed hearing issue, but at the time we just chalked it up to his quirks, unaware of how it would fuel Tommy's growing frustration. But looking back on it, there was probably a medical explanation for it. Maybe he was hard of hearing, and no one ever put it together. But either way, Tommy didn't find it funny, and he didn't share our sympathy for Danny's condition either. About a week after moving in, Danny mentioned that Tommy hated the alarm, saying it woke him up and kept him from falling back asleep, giving Danny dirty looks over it, though Danny just laughed it off, promising to find an alternative. Danny mentioned it maybe a week after moving in. Tommy hates the alarm, he said, casual, like it was nothing. It says it wakes him up and he can't fall back asleep when it does, and keeps giving me these looks about it. He chuckled. I told him I'd use something else. I knew Danny too well. He was slow to follow through on small promises like that, having used the same screaming docking station for years without ever bothering to adjust it, a habit I warned. Him might cause trouble with someone like Tommy. You know me, I did know him. He wouldn't find something else, or rather it took Danny way longer than it should to get around to the little things like that. That iPod station had been screaming at him for years by this point, and he'd never once bothered to replace it or set it quieter. I half joked, "Be careful, dude, Tommy's one odd duck." But Danny brushed it off, telling me I worried too much, his carefree attitude a stark contrast to the unease that had settled in my gut since meeting his roommate. "Be careful, dude," I said, only half joking. Tommy's one odd duck. Danny laughed again, and I was told I worry too much. Things took a darker turn quickly. Danny texted me one night about Tommy's strange behavior, sending a picture of a note on the fridge that read, "Silence is golden," in block letters, written with a black marker, a message Danny found dramatic but amusing, adding a laughing emoji. But things got bad fast. One night Danny texted me about Tommy acting strange. It was a picture of a note on the fridge. "Silence is golden," scrolled in block letters with a black marker. "Dude's got a flair for drama," Danny wrote, adding a laughing emoji. Another time, Danny caught Tommy standing in the hallway outside his room at night, motionless, staring at the door, claiming he thought he'd heard something when Danny confronted him after getting water, an encounter that left Danny rattled but still unwilling to act. Then another time he said Tommy had stood in the hallway outside of his room at night, not moving, just staring at the door. "Caught him when I went for water." Danny texted, "Freaked me out," but he just said that he thought he heard something. I urged Danny to leave, telling him to crash on my couch if he needed to, but he insisted things weren't that bad, especially with the rent being so cheap, a decision I later wished I'd pushed harder against. I told him to get out, find a new place at that point to crash on my couch if he needed to, but he told me that things weren't that bad, especially not since the rent was so cheap, and I should have pushed harder. I should have shown up with a truck and dragged him out of there myself. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a cheap desk lamp for Danny's dorm room years ago, only to find it flickered incessantly, a small annoyance that now seemed trivial compared to the growing tension in his apartment. Tommy's behavior wasn't just odd, it was menacing. His silent stares and cryptic notes a stark contrast to Danny's laid-back demeanor, a contrast that should have been a red flag, but one Danny was too trusting to see. I'd known Danny long enough to recognize his blind spots, his tendency to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it, a trait that had gotten him into trouble before, but never like this. The apartment itself seemed to amplify the tension, its cramped layout leaving little room for escape, the thin walls carrying every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of the city outside, a constant reminder of how close Tommy was at all times. I started checking in more often, texting Danny daily to make sure he was okay, but his responses were always the same, casual, dismissive, filled with his usual humor, as if Tommy's actions were just a quirky anecdote and not a warning. I couldn't shake the image of Tommy standing in that hallway, his motionless figure a silhouette of threat, a memory that haunted me as I went about my days, my worry for Danny growing with each passing moment. I'd lie awake at night, replaying our conversations, wondering if I'd missed something, if there was a way I could have convinced him to leave before it was too late, a guilt that would soon become all too real. The city outside my window felt distant, its lights a faint glow against the darkness of my thoughts, a darkness that mirrored the storm I feared was brewing in Danny's apartment, a storm I wasn't sure he'd survive. The tension in that apartment pulsed, a threat weaving through my fears, its silver menace glinting as it loomed. A presence that wasn't just a note, wasn't just a stare, but something alive. Something that growled with a hunger for violence, whispering promises of tragedy as I waited for Danny's next text. Tommy's silent rage erupted in a horrifying act, taking Danny's life and leaving me with a scar I'll carry forever, a reminder of the danger that can lurk behind a quiet facade. Looking back, I realized I should have done more, should have shown up with a truck and dragged Danny out of that apartment myself. But hindsight is always clearer. A bitter lesson I learned too late. But hindsight is always 20/20, I guess. It was a Tuesday when it happened, a day that started like any other. But I hadn't heard from Danny, which was unusual since he typically sent me dumb texts we'd laugh over later, his silence leaving me uneasy as the hours ticked by. It was a Tuesday when it happened. I hadn't heard from Danny all day, which wasn't like him at all, because he usually sent me dumb texts that we'd crack up over later. By afternoon, my worry turned into a gnawing anxiety, my phone silent, despite my constant checks for messages or missed calls, a void that grew more ominous with each passing minute. But that day my phone stayed silent, and by afternoon I was preoccupied with worry, checking it every few minutes for text messages or missed calls, but nothing came through. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to Danny's apartment, my heart pounding as I found the door unlocked, a detail that sent a chill down my spine since Danny, despite his messiness, was never careless about security. By the evening, the worry was eating at me, so I drove over to Danny's apartment and found the door was unlocked when I got there. By his own admission, Danny was a slob. He'd leave clothes everywhere, leave dishes piled up, but he wasn't careless, and he wouldn't leave his door unlocked. I stepped inside, the living room dark except for the flickering light of the TV, casting eerie shadows on the cluttered coffee table, littered with empty beer cans and chip bags, and I called out Danny's name, my voice echoing in the stillness, with no reply. I stepped inside and found the living room was dark except for the flicker of the TV. I called out Danny's name, but got no answer, as I moved past the cluttered coffee table with its empty beer cans and crumpled up chip bags, and then into his bedroom. I found him in his bedroom, sprawled on the bed, one arm hanging over the edge as if he'd fallen asleep mid-nap. But the sheets were soaked in blood, a dark stain spreading from beneath him, dripping onto the floor where his docking station lay smashed, its wires spilling out like entrails. And I found him on the bed. Danny was sprawled out, one arm flung over the edge like he'd fallen asleep mid-snooze the way he always did. But the sheets were soaked red, a dark stain spreading out from under him and pulling on the mattress. Blood trailed down the side, dripping slow and steady onto the floor, where that damn docking station sat smashed to pieces, plastic cracked wires spilling out. His throat had been cut, a jagged, brutal gash that looked like it had been hacked open with a dull blade. The wound ragged and torn, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling, a sight that made me stumble back, my chest tightening with horror. Danny's throat was cut, a jagged, ugly gash that looked like it had been hacked open with something dull, not clean but completely ragged, like the skin had torn under the force. When I saw his eyes staring at the ceiling completely empty, I stumbled back with this tight feeling in my chest. Then I heard a creak from the hallway behind me. Tommy was there, standing just outside the door, his face blank, devoid of emotion, as if he were waiting for something mundane, his calmness more terrifying than any rage could have been. And then I heard it, the creak of a floorboard coming from the hallway behind me. Tommy was there, standing just outside the door. His face was blank. No anger, no panic, just nothing, like it was waiting for a freaking bus or something. He spoke, his voice flat, saying he couldn't stop that noise every morning. I asked him, I warned him, his words chilling me to the core as I stood frozen, my mind screaming to run, but my body rooted in place. He couldn't stop, Said that noise every morning, I asked him. I warned him I froze, my brain screaming at me to run, to yell at him, to do anything, but my legs were rooted to that spot. Tommy's eyes flicked to the broken docking station, then back to me, and he asked, "You heard it too, didn't you? You know how it was." A question that snapped me out of my paralysis, sending me bolting for the door. He took a step closer, his shoes silent there on the carpet. I saw his eyes flick to the broken clock and then back to me. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he asked before saying, "You know how it was." I lunged forward, my shoulder slamming into the doorframe as I slipped through, fumbling with the front door for a split second before it burst open. Tommy's slow, deliberate steps echoing behind me in the narrow stairwell as I ran for my life. He took one more step towards me and I bolted. I don't remember deciding to. I just remember my body lunging forward and my shoulder slamming into the doorframe before I slipped through. I hit the front door hard, fumbling the knob for a split second before it flew open and banged against the wall. Behind me, I could hear Tommy not running but taking these slow, steady steps that echoed in the narrow stairwell. I made it to my car, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before getting the door open, and I didn't look back until I was speeding away, seeing Tommy standing in the street, his empty gaze following me as I fled. I made it too. My car and my hands were shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice before I jammed them into the lock. I didn't look back until I was peeling out, and there he was, standing in the street, watching me drive off with that same empty look in his eyes. The cops arrested Tommy later that night. I'd called them from a gas station a mile away. My mind so shattered they had to ask me to repeat myself. They found him sitting on the couch, the knife in the sink, unwashed, and he didn't resist as they took him away, muttering about the alarm. The cops picked him up later that night. I'd called them from a gas station a mile away. My brain so fried they had to keep asking me to repeat myself. They found Tommy in the apartment sitting on the couch with the knife that he'd used to kill. Danny sitting in the kitchen sink. He hadn't bothered to wash it. He didn't resist either, didn't fight, he just let the cops cuff him and take him away. They told me he kept muttering about the alarm, how it had to stop. Danny had been dead since morning, likely killed right after his alarm went off at 6 a.m. And Tommy had sat there all day with his body, the TV flickering in the background, a chilling detail that haunts me still. Danny had been dead since morning. They said probably killed right after that clock went off at 6 a.m. Tommy had sat there all day with him, waiting, just him and the body, the TV flickering in the background. I still think about Danny constantly, his laughter, his stubbornness, how he ignored the warning signs, and I think about Tommy, how close I came to being his next victim, the sound of that docking station echoing in my nightmares. I still think about Danny a lot, how he laughed off the notes, how he was too stubborn or stupid to see that danger. I still think about Tommy too, and how close I came to being next. That docking station was gone, smashed to pieces on the bloodied floor. But I still hear the sound that it made sometimes whenever I think about everything that happened. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a cheap guitar for Danny back in high school, only to find the strings snapped. A faint echo of the broken trust that had cost him his life, a trust I'd never again take for granted. The image of Danny on that bed, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing, was seared into my memory. A scar that no amount of time could erase. A reminder of the fragility of life and the danger that can hide behind a quiet exterior. I stopped going. Near that part of town, the memory of the apartment too raw, its peeling paint and mildewed stairwell now a monument to my failure to act, to save my best friend from a fate I'd sensed but couldn't prevent. The city moved on, its rhythm unchanged, but I couldn't. Every heavy metal song, every creak of a floorboard, every moment of silence became a trigger, pulling me back to that night, to the sound of Tommy's voice, to the realization that I'd almost joined Danny in death. I started keeping my doors locked even during the day, a habit born of fear, a fear that Tommy's empty gaze had instilled in me, a fear that followed me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the cost of ignoring my instincts. I'd lost more than a friend that night. I'd lost a piece of myself, a piece that died with Danny, a piece that would forever be haunted by the silent threat of Tommy, a threat I'd never forget. The horror of that night pulsed, a guilt weaving through my soul, its silver weight glinting as it lingered, A presence that wasn't just a loss, wasn't just a memory, but something alive, something that growled with a hunger for vigilance, whispering promises of regret as I carried on. The whispering shadow of Adam. My time in juvie was already a nightmare, but sharing a cell with Adam turned it into a haunting I'd never escape. I had a troubled childhood, one that led me down a path of reckless decisions, though I was never the type to harm animals or indulge in cruelty. I wasn't that far gone, but I did have a dangerous fascination with fire. I had a weird childhood, so I was kind of a messed up kid. Not the kind that went out torturing cats or lasering ants to death with a magnifying glass. I wasn't that far gone. My friend Cookie and I started small, burning piles of leaves and old newspapers in the alley behind his house, mesmerized by the way the flames danced and consumed everything in their path, a thrill that felt like a release from the chaos of our lives. But me and my buddy Cookie, we like starting fires. It started small at first. We had burned stuff in the alley behind his house, whether it was piles of dry leaves, old newspapers, or whatever else we could snag, and I remember the crackle of the flames, the way they danced over whatever we set on fire, and it really fascinated us. But at 14, we made a catastrophic mistake. We set fire to a shed in someone's backyard just to see how big the blaze could get, not expecting the wind to carry embers to the neighboring house, engulfing half the block in smoke before the fire trucks arrived. Then one day we messed up big time. When we were 14, we torched a shed in some guy's backyard just to see how big the fire could get. We didn't mean for it to spread. We didn't mean for the wind to kick up and send embers flying into the backyard of the house next door, but they did, and they took off by the time the fire trucks showed. Half the block was swimming in a haze of black smoke. We thought we'd gotten away with it, fleeing the scene as the sirens wailed. But a few days later, the cops came knocking, dragging Cookie and me to booking, where our history of minor run-ins with the law sealed our fate. 9 months in a youth detention center, or juvie as we called it. And we ran off thinking that we'd gotten away with it. But it was just days before the cops came knocking on mine and Cookie's door. We got arrested, dragged down to booking the whole 9 yards. Then, after admitting what we did, and on account of our other run-ins with the law, we each got 9 months at a youth detention center, a fancy name for juvenile hall. Juvie was a harsh, unforgiving place, a concrete fortress in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire that gleamed under the floodlights at night, the air inside thick with the stench of sweat, bleach, and a sourness I could never quite place. Juvenile hall, or juvie as we called it, was rough as hell, believe it or not. The building was this concrete block in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire that was so sharp that it was shiny at night, and inside it smelled like sweat bleach and something sour that you couldn't quite pin down. The walls were a dull gray, the fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, and the daily routine was a grueling cycle. Wake at 6 a.m., cold oatmeal for breakfast, then group exercise or therapy sessions meant to fix us, followed by dinner, a brief recreation period, and lights out by 9 p.m. The walls were grey and the lights buzzed constantly with a low hum that you never seemed to get used to. You'd wake up at 6 was, eat cold oatmeal for breakfast, and then it was either group exercise or group therapy sessions, where they'd try to fix us. They'd feed us dinner, give us a little recreation time, and then it was lights out by 9 p.m. The other kids were a mixed bag. Some were decent enough, guys I'd play hoops with or trade snacks, even forming a few close friendships that helped me survive the monotony. But others were the kind you knew to steer clear of, their reputations making it easy to spot trouble. The other kids were a mixed bag. Some were okay, I guess, guys I'd chewed hoops or trade snacks with, and a couple of them even became close friends. But then there were the other kids, the ones everyone else was afraid of. To their credit, they made it easy to work out who not to mess with. There were the loud ones, the ones who made a lot of noise and caused chaos, easy to avoid if you kept your head down, but the real danger came from the quiet ones, the ones you didn't realize you needed to fear until it was too late, like hidden traps waiting to spring. And if a kid was too weird or scary, you knew to either avoid them or treat them with kid gloves. But then there were the kids you didn't know that you needed to be scared of, and to me they were always way more dangerous. Those first kids were like machine guns. They made a lot of noise and you knew to keep your head down whenever they did. but then those other kids, the quiet ones, they were almost like landmines. You didn't know that you stepped on one until it was too late. 4 months into my sentence, I was assigned a new cellmate, Adam, a skinny, pale kid with greasy black hair and dark circles under his eyes, who arrived one afternoon with a guard who dumped his thin blanket and plastic bag of clothes on the bottom bunk. And Adam, he was one of those. I got stuck with him as a roommate after about 4 months into my sentence. Our room was small, just 2 metal bunks bolted to the floor, a chipped sink in the corner, and a toilet that smelled bad, no matter how much they scrubbed it. The window was little more than a slit way up high, letting in just enough daylight to remind you that the world was still out there. Adam showed up one afternoon, escorted by a guard, who dumped his stuff, a thin blanket and a plastic bag of clothes, on the bottom bunk. He didn't look at me at first, just sat hunched over, staring at the floor, and I assumed he was just another scared newbie, overwhelmed by the harsh reality of juvie. But I was wrong. There was something far more unsettling about Adam. He was skinny and pale, with greasy black hair that just kind of hung on his face, and these dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in literal years. He didn't look at me at first. He just sat there, hunched over, staring at the floor, and I figured he was either shy or scared like most newbies were, but I was wrong. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a cheap basketball for our rec time, only to find it deflated, a small disappointment that paled in comparison to the growing dread I felt sharing a cell with Adam. The cell itself was a claustrophobic box, the metal bunks cold and unyielding, the chipped sink dripping incessantly, and the toilet stench a constant reminder of where I was, a place that stripped away any sense of humanity. Juvie had a way of breaking you down, its routines designed to crush your spirit. The grey walls and buzzing lights, a relentless assault on your senses. But I'd managed to find a rhythm, a way to survive, until Adam arrived. His presence shifted. The air, a subtle change I couldn't quite name, like the feeling you get before a storm, a heaviness that made every moment in that cell feel charged with an unspoken tension. I'd survived 4 months in juvie by keeping my head down, making allies where I could, and avoiding the ones who thrived on violence. But Adam was different. He didn't fit into either category, his silence a mystery that set him apart from the loud troublemakers and the quiet survivors. I tried to focus on the routine, the daily grind of waking, eating, and enduring the monotony, but Adam's arrival disrupted that fragile balance, his hunched figure on the bottom bunk a constant reminder that something was wrong, something I couldn't yet understand. The other kids in juvie whispered about the landmines, the ones who seemed harmless until they exploded, and as I lay on my bunk that first night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Adam was one of them. A ticking bomb I'd been forced to share a cell with, a bomb I feared would detonate in ways I couldn't predict. The arrival of Adam pulsed, a dread weaving through my cell, its silver chill glinting as it settled, a presence that wasn't just a new face, wasn't just a bunkmate, but something alive, something that whispered with a hunger for darkness, whispering promises of fear as I lay awake. Adam's eerie habits began to unravel me, his sleepless nights and whispered conversations with an unseen presence hinting at a darkness I couldn't ignore, pulling me deeper into his shadowed world. I could tell Adam was strange almost immediately. He barely slept, and the first night I woke to the creak of his bunk as he sat upright, wide-eyed in the dark, staring at the wall with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. So I could tell that he was weird almost right away because he didn't seem to sleep much. The first night I woke up to the bunk creaking as he shifted and caught him sitting upright, staring at the wall all wide-eyed in the dark. I thought it was just the typical anxiety of a new kid, the kind of unease that grips you when you first arrive in juvie. But as the nights went on, I realized this was just how Adam was. He rarely got more than a couple of hours of sleep, and it started to mess with my own rest. And I thought that he just had the new fish blues, same as most kids got on their first night. But as it turned out, that was just Adam. I don't think he got more than a couple of hours of sleep a night, and it got so bad that it started to mess with my own sleep schedule. I'd lie there, a pillow wrapped around my head, trying to block out the sound of his restless movements. But his lack of sleep wasn't the only thing that unnerved me. Adam had a hygiene problem, the stench of sweat and unwashed skin clinging to his bedding, making our cell nearly unbearable. I'd lie there with a pillow wrapped around my head, trying to tune out the sound of him whispering things to himself in the dark hours later. I'd wake up exhausted with my eyes burning, and he'd be there, eyes completely fixed on that same spot with the same bloodshot baggy stare. Adam wasn't the biggest fan of personal hygiene either, so much so that the room started to weak because of the stink that clung to his bedding. It smelled like sweat and unwashed skin mixing with the stale air. I'd hold my breath whenever I passed him, the smell so overpowering it made my stomach churn. And one day I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted him saying, "Dude, please, you've got to take a shower. I'm begging you, you stink." Man. And I'd hold my breath whenever I walked past him just so I wouldn't have to smell it. One day I couldn't take it anymore, and I told him, "Dude, please, you got to take a shower. I'm begging you. You stink, man." He didn't respond at first, just tilted his head as if considering my words, and a few hours later he shuffled off to the showers, returning dripping wet, but to my dismay, the smell lingered. He'd just stood under the water without using soap, leaving me more frustrated than before. He didn't answer. He just slowly tilted his head like he was thinking it over, and then a few hours later he shuffled off to the showers. When he came back dripping wet, I was so relieved that I thanked him, but I spoke too soon. It took me minutes before I realized that somehow he still smelled bad, like he just stood there under the hot water without using any soap. The smell was bad. Really bad. But the smell was nothing compared to his whispering. Adam talked to himself constantly, a low, scratchy murmur that grated on my nerves, especially at night when the cell was dark and the shadows stretched across the walls like skeletal hands reaching for me. But far worse was the whispering Adam talked to himself all the time in these low, scratchy murmurs that really grated on me. And by day it was annoying, he'd muttered under his breath while I tried to read the beat-up comics that were passed, around stuff that I couldn't make out but couldn't ignore. But then at night it turned very creepy. I'd wake up to it faint and steady like a radio left on in another room. And in the dark with the shadows stretching across the walls, it sounded like something out of a horror movie. During the day it was annoying. He'd mutter under his breath while I tried to read the worn comics that circulated among the inmates, his words too soft to make out but too persistent to ignore, a constant distraction that made my skin crawl. I'd squint at him through the gloom of the night and see his lips moving, and that constant hiss cutting through the silence made my goddamn skin crawl. At night it became something else entirely. I'd wake to the faint, steady sound, like a radio left on in another room, and in the darkness, with the shadows stretching across the walls, it felt like something out of a nightmare, his lips moving in a rhythm that seemed almost ritualistic. I put up with it for weeks until one night when I snapped I barely slept. My eyes were burning and Adam was at it again, whispering in the dark. I just sat up, bunk squeaking, and said something like, "Dude, why do you always keep talking to yourself? It's driving me nuts." I put up with it for weeks, my exhaustion mounting, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, until one night I snapped, sitting up on my bunk, the metal squeaking as I demanded, "Dude, why do you always keep talking to yourself? It's driving me nuts." He stopped, and then slowly turned his head toward me like a puppet on strings. "I'm not talking to myself," he said. His voice was quiet but clear. "I'm talking to my little sister." He stopped, his head turning slowly toward me, his voice quiet but clear as he said, "I'm not talking to myself, I'm talking to my little sister." A statement that hit me like a punch, filling me with a mix of confusion and dread. "Then write her a letter or something," I replied, "or call her, I don't care, just stop waking me up." Adam stared at me unblinking and told me she's dead, and his reply hit me like a ton of bricks. I tried to brush it off, saying, "Then write her a letter or something, or call her, I don't care, just stop waking me up." But Adam stared at me unblinking and said, "She's dead." His words striking me like a ton of bricks, guilt twisting through me as I realized I'd stumbled into something far darker than I'd imagined. I felt bad, really bad. This horrible guilt twisting through my guts like a corkscrew. I'd lost people too. Not anyone like a sibling or anything like that. But I knew that it hurt. And I remember rubbing my eyes and sighing before I said something. Like, "I'm sorry, man, I didn't mean to upset you. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a used comic book for juvie rec time, only to find pages torn out, a small frustration that now felt insignificant compared to the weight. Perv Adams' revelation, a weight that settled over our cell like a shroud. The cell, already a prison within a prison, became a stage for Adams' grief. His whispered conversations a haunting reminder of the loss he carried, a loss I couldn't begin to understand, but could feel in the air around us. I'd lost people, too, friends to the streets, family to distance, but never a sibling, never someone so close that their absence became a living presence, a ghost that seemed to linger in the shadows of our cell. The other inmates had their own demons, their own stories of loss and regret, but Adams felt different, his connection to his sister a tether to something I couldn't see, something that made the darkness of juvie feel even deeper, even more suffocating. I tried to focus on the routine, the daily grind of survival, but Adams' whispers followed me, a constant reminder that I was sharing a space with someone whose pain had taken on a life of its own, a life that seemed to watch me, from the shadows, waiting for something I couldn't name. The whispers of Adam pulsed, a sorrow weaving through our cell, its silver grief glinting as it grew, a presence that wasn't just a voice, wasn't just a memory, but something alive, something that murmured with a hunger for acknowledgement, whispering promises of revelation as I listened in the dark. Adam's chilling confession revealed a horrifying truth, turning our cell into a haunted space where his sister's presence lingered, a shadow I could never unsee, a shadow that followed me long after I left juvie. I felt a deep guilt for snapping at Adam, knowing the pain of loss myself, though not to the extent of losing a sibling, and I rubbed my eyes, sighing, "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to upset you." My voice softer, trying to bridge the gap I'd unwittingly created. I felt bad, really bad. This horrible guilt twisting through my guts like a corkscrew. I'd lost people too, not anyone like a sibling or anything like that, but I knew that it hurt, and I remember rubbing my eyes and sighing before I said something like, "I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to upset you." To my surprise, Adam let out a soft, high-pitched chuckle, devoid of any warmth, saying, "It's okay. It's me who should be sorry." His tone sending a chill down my spine, a tone that hinted at a story I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. But then, to my surprise, Adam let out this soft, high-pitched chuckle that somehow lacked any kind of joy to it. "It's okay," he said, adopting a tone that made me more and more nervous. "It's me who should be sorry." He didn't wait for me to ask, launching into his story with a slow, steady voice, as if he'd been waiting to unburden himself. His words painting a picture of a day when he was 5 and his sister was 3, taking a bath together, arguing over a toy as kids do. He didn't wait for me to ask. He just started talking with his voice slow and steady, like he'd been waiting to tell someone for years and years and years. Adam said that one day when he was 5 and his sister was 3, they'd been taking a bath together. They'd been splashing each other, arguing over some toy, the usual kid stuff. But Adam had decided he'd had enough. He didn't want a little sister anymore. Didn't want her taking his toys, his space, his parents' attention. So he bashed her head against the side of the tub to stun her, then held her under the water, her tiny body thrashing as he watched her drown. But Adam decided he'd had enough. He didn't want to have a little sister anymore. He didn't want her taking his toys, his space, his parents' attention. So he bashed her head on the side of the tub to stun her, and then pushed her head under the water and held it there. She kicked and fought, her little legs thrashing, while her feet smacked the sides of the tub. He described how she fought, her legs kicking, her feet smacking the tub, her small fingernails clawing at his arms, bubbles breaking the surface as water spilled over the edge. But he didn't let go, watching her face under the water, eyes wide with panic, mouth open in a silent scream, until she went limp, her hair fanning out like weeds. He held her there as she fought for her life bubbles breaking the surface, as water sloshed over the edge of the tub and soaked the bathroom floor. Her hands clawed at his arms, he said, her tiny little fingernails digging into his flesh. But Adam didn't let go. He watched her face under the water, eyes wide, panicking mouth open in a scream that made no sound. After a while, his little sister stopped moving. She turned limp, floating just under the surface, with her hair fanning out like weeds. Adam sat there staring at her lifeless body until his mother walked in and screamed, and he told his parents it was an accident, that she'd slipped and hit her head, a lie they desperately wanted to believe, clinging to it as they buried the truth with her tiny coffin. Adam said he sat there staring at her lifeless body until her mum walked in and started screaming. He told his parents it was an accident, that his sister had slipped, hit her head, and that he thought that she was just messing around until it was. Too late, he said his parents didn't want to believe he was capable of murder, so they swallowed his story hook, line and sinker, and clung to it even, and then buried the truth with his sister's little coffin. The police didn't dig too deep, accepting the story of an accidental drowning, unwilling to add more pain to a grieving family by taking their only remaining child, allowing Adam to walk free, untouched by the law for a crime no one wanted to believe a child could commit. The cops didn't do too much digging. Not with Adam's parents covering for him. Little kids don't kill, they said. Not on purpose, not like that. Besides, the poor girl's mum and dad had enough tragedy to deal with. Taking their only living child away from them just seemed cruel. And so Adam got away with it. He walked totally free after drowning his own sister. No punishment, no record, nothing. I asked if he regretted it, hoping for some sign of remorse, and he said yes, but not for the reasons I expected. Not because he missed her or felt guilt, but because her death had bound her to him, a relentless presence that refused to let him go. And looking back on it, I think I just wanted to make sure that he wasn't a total monster, but I asked if he regretted it, and to my relief, he said yes. But that relief was short-lived. He didn't regret it because he missed her, and he certainly didn't regret getting all that sympathy over the years for being the poor little boy who watched his sister drown. He regretted killing her because now she wouldn't leave him alone. Ever since that day, Adam said his sister had followed him, her spirit an inescapable shadow. He tried ignoring her at first, pretending he couldn't see or hear her, but that only made her angry, her form twisting into something sharp and hollow, looming over him at night with a silent scream. Ever since the day he drowned her in that tub, Adam's little sister had been following him around. He said he tried ignoring her at first and would pretend that he couldn't see or hear her, but that just made her mad. And when she got mad, she'd change. Adam said that whenever his little sister got angry, she'd stretch tall and thin, her limbs and face twisting into something sharp and hollow. She'd loom over him at night, silently screaming, just like she had in the tub. So he started whispering to her, talking to keep her calm, not caring if it made him look crazy, because the alternative, her wrath, was far worse. A choice that turned our cell into a haunted space where her presence seemed to linger in every shadow. So he started talking to her, whispering just to keep her happy. He didn't mind if it made him look crazy, because the alternative was far worse. I asked, my voice barely a whisper, "Is she here right now?" And Adam nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the corner near the sink, a spot where the shadows seemed to deepen, the air growing heavier, colder, as if something unseen was watching me. After he finished his little story, I remember sort of sitting there feeling the air get a little colder. "Is she here right now?" I had to force the words out, and then in response, Adam slowly nodded before flicking his eyes toward the corner near the sink, and my skin prickled, every hair standing up. I thought of a marketplace deal where I'd bought a cheap flashlight for Juvie, only to find it wouldn't turn on, a small betrayal that now felt trivial compared to the terror of sharing. A cell with Adam and the ghost of his sister, a terror that followed me long after I left. That night I couldn't sleep, my eyes darting to the corner Adam had indicated. The faint drip of the sink, the only sound in the darkness, a sound that seemed to carry a rhythm, a whisper, as if she were there, watching, waiting. Juvie had always been a place of fear, its grey walls and buzzing lights a constant reminder of my mistakes, but now it felt like a prison in more ways than one, a place where the living and the dead coexisted, where Adam's sister became as real as the concrete around us. I started noticing things after that night, the way the air seemed to shift when Adam whispered, the way the shadows in our cell seemed to move against the light, the way my own reflection in the sink's rusted mirror sometimes seemed distorted. as if someone else were looking back. I'd survived juvie by keeping my head down, by avoiding trouble, but now trouble had found me, a trouble I couldn't see, couldn't fight, a trouble that whispered in the dark, a trouble that carried the weight of a child's death, a weight I feared would never let me go. The shadow of his sister pulsed, a terror weaving through our cell, its silver chill glinting as it watched, a presence that wasn't just a story, wasn't just a whisper, but something alive, something that stared with a hunger for vengeance, whispering promises of eternity as I trembled in the dark.